Every human being, that's an adult at least, should be able to go 24 hours without food, be fine cognitively, be fine emotionally, be fine physiologically. That's not a long period of time. If you're like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I can't focus, I'm such a jerk right now because I haven't had lunch, like that's a sensitive physiology and that's not a good spot to be in. So that's a case where like we probably want to be more resilient.
Dr. Andy Galpin. People change their mind on things. Scientists change their mind on things all the time. It's one of my favorite series to do. What are a few things that you've changed your perspective on or had an evolution of thought on over the last, say, 5-7 years?
I put a link down below for 30% off through Thrive Market, simply because A, I use them all the time. It's a good recommendation. They're a sponsor on this channel, but also they have betaine supplements there. So you can go to Thrive Market, you can search in their supplement section for betaine. They have freeze-dried beets. They have other beet snacks. They also have sustainable meat and seafood options, so you can get shrimp. They also have wheat bran. So you can get all the things that are rich in betaine, but you can get them at 30% off because you're using that special link down below. Plus you can do the rest of your grocery shopping too. So you can do all your grocery shopping, load up your grocery cart, get 30% off, and get a free $60 gift when you use that link down below. So when it comes down to getting specific things, Thrive Market really makes a lot of sense because you can also tag it along with your regular grocery as well. And then it gets delivered to your doorstep. So super easy peasy lemon squeezy. So that link, again, exclusive discount at 30% off for your whole grocery cart in that link down below.
There's a lot of areas we could go into on this one. Maybe one that comes to mind, it's a little technical, but I think we can start here, and that is one of the primary mechanisms that causes muscle growth. I have changed my mind on a little bit, and that is metabolic disruptions or metabolic disturbances. So to wind back the clock a little bit, a number of years ago, people were trying to understand what actually causes muscle to grow, and there's got to be some sort of stimulus. And we certainly know strength training does it, and we know how to go about it from a practical perspective, but we didn't necessarily know like molecularly from the cellular and tissue level what was happening. Until Brad Schoenfeld had this really awesome review paper he published, and he said, hey, I think there's 3 general mechanisms. One of them being mechanical tension, which is the actual tension of the muscle cells as they are stretched, like when you're exercising and contracting. Another is these metabolic disturbances. And then the third one is a category of tissue damage. So there's actually breaking down the cell wall. And the metabolic stuff actually made sense for a long time because we were seeing things like blood flow restriction training. So when you go in and you cut off blood flow to an area and you can lift extremely low amounts of weight, body weight, and you can do large repetition ranges, and you're still seeing equal amounts of hypertrophy as if you were lifting weights. And so something had to explain that because there's not a lot of mechanical tension there. There wasn't a lot of muscle damage there, so it had to be these metabolic pathways. And that moved, and I thought, okay, there's something there. You can also start looking at other avenues of exercise, say doing exercise on an assault bike and generating high amounts of metabolic waste like lactate. Those are also associated with some muscle growth. And there's lots of evidence of those things causing growth. But as more and more research has come out, I just don't really think that's playing a part. I don't have an answer as to what actually is explaining those results, but there's just been a number of papers come out from different labs that say, I just don't think those things are actually directly involved in muscle growth. And if they are much lower than we thought. Sort of at minimum, I feel confident right now saying that mechanical tension is clearly the biggest driver there. That doesn't mean then to say the metabolic side has 0 impact. It's just certainly not equivalent to mechanical tension. And we've always known for a long time rather that the muscle damage is also a pretty minimal contributor there. So it seems like a bulk of that thing really is coming from tension, some part of it coming from the metabolic side, but not as much as we maybe had thought a few years ago.
Do you think there could be a relationship with pain and nociception and possible growth as well? I mean, it's a mutual friend of ours. I guess no one knows him, so we can say Paulie. We were talking about BFR, and he's not convinced that lactate is one of the main drivers of hypertrophy, even with BFR. He thinks it has something to do with actually the physical, mechanical sort of tension that's there, causing essentially an additional pain effect, but also just the actual effect of constriction itself, doing something with the axon and kind of affecting it that way, which is pure idea, hypothetical on his side.
That's Paulie though.
Yeah, that's kind of how he goes. Any idea like how the growth might occur from BFR if it's not necessarily coming from the lactate side of things or metabolic waste?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I would say that idea is as good as any. that I've heard. I don't have any strong data to refute that. At this point, it's sort of like any idea is a good idea until we learn otherwise. So it's a great question. I don't know the answer to. There's just so many ways, even when you say something like metabolic waste or metabolic damage or metabolic disturbances, like we term it lots of different ways.
Yeah.
That can mean a lot of different things. And maybe it's just we haven't gone for the right style yet. So maybe it has nothing to do with lactate. Maybe it has nothing to do with oxygen. And maybe it is something else, right? So there are many ways that your tissue can be resilient. And what I mean by that is very rarely do we have places in physiology where one thing will only do one thing.
Yeah.
We have backup systems and backups on backups. And so it's most likely being like, okay, if we isolate this piece out in a particular scientific model like oxygen or lactate, and then that no longer explains all of the hypertrophy, but maybe it still does contribute it when it's in this mosaic of physiology. Because things move independent, right? It's not this one lever flips one light on. It's more of like you touched your finger in the water and now everything has changed a little bit. So you can't just pull that out and assume that that's true always in the case. So I don't know, probably a combination of all those things. So cellular sensitization, perhaps something going on with the cell signaling cascade or gene expression at some point. Don't know, but it's probably not just exclusively the metabolic waste.
Yeah. When you speak of the mechanical side, I'm assuming there would be an intersect of the mechanical side and sort of the actual muscle damage side. So, I mean, at a certain point, the actual mechanical effect is so much that it's causing damage. But is there, even at a smaller scale, where you're saying, okay, I have enough mechanical load or volume or whatever it may be to initiate hypertrophy, to trigger hypertrophy, does that happen independent of trauma? Or is there always like a little bit of sort of the muscle damage that's occurring even under a smaller mechanical load?
It's certainly a Venn diagram, right? So there's always some sort of crossover there. I guess if you ask it this way, do you have to create damage to stimulate muscle growth? And the answer is clearly no, not at all. That is not a requirement to do that. Easy way to think about this is simply eat protein. The consumption of protein will stimulate muscle protein synthesis to a level that will actually result in whole muscle growth. That requires zero damage whatsoever. On the other end of the spectrum, if you do damage tissue from things like exercise, will that cause some growth? Well, probably some.
Yeah.
And so it's clearly part of the equation. It is correlated. It is involved. It's one of the mechanisms, but it's not a requirement at all.
Okay, what's another thing you've changed your mind on?
Another thing I've changed my mind on, I'll go to the benefits of isometric training. This is something, isometrics are staying in the same position, right? So imagine doing a push-up and holding the push-up position, right? Or doing a biceps curls and holding there as opposed to contracting up and down. I didn't do those for decades and would have basically said, like, these are complete garbage. I actually find them to be super beneficial for a lot of people. Now, I want to be really clear. I don't find them to be more beneficial than concentric or eccentric training or range of motion. I feel them to be generally probably on aggregate less effective. But why I'm saying I've changed my mind is I would have told you for many years that they are zero. And they're not a zero. And so that is still a important change. I think they are a really nice thing to use. They are not my first stop or second stop, but they can be really beneficial. We have used them a lot with our high-performing athletes and our other clients for things like, can we contract and get tissue activated? Can we get some growth? Can we get some strength improvements while we work around joint injuries? Right? Can we get in this range of motion? Great. Now, are we only getting strong in that specific range of motion? Probably. But if this is our entry point into exercise, to me, that's still a big win. Right? So this is something, again, we've used with our high-performing athletes, with our entry point athletes. It's just a pro and con. And it is a nice little tool to bring in where you can specifically target and you can tinker around. I don't feel it in my pec at this angle. I don't feel it in my pec at this angle. Oh, now I feel it. Okay, great. Let's just practice holding it there. Let's just learn how to contract your pec, if that's the muscle we care about, or your soleus, or your VMO, or like whatever muscle we're going after. So just getting people to learn how to contract the muscle and then just holding that. And you do that for a few weeks of your training program. Right? It's a couple of exercises in your warm-up, or it's somewhere other part of your program. It's not the only thing you're doing for a year of your training. I have really changed my tune on that big time. You can stimulate growth from there. It's not as much as other styles of training, but you can do that and all the other benefits I've just mentioned and certainly more. We've incorporated those more than I would have anticipated a few years ago.
But from a preservation standpoint, someone that's already built mass and it's like, hey, like I just need to maintain sort of thing.
Yeah,
So,
I think that there's really no issue there. I also, actually, this brought up another idea. We like it a lot for traveling. So hotel workouts.
yeah.
It's like, yeah, not as good, but can you, like, it's really hard to do something that challenges your legs if you're somewhat strong in a hotel, unless you're going to do just hundreds of repetitions of an air squat. But you can hold a split squat. You can hold a split squat position for 90 seconds,
Yeah.
and you will be shaking. Like, great. So it's just about the context of what I'm saying, how it works or what it does. It is not a substitute for the barbell and all those things, but it is a great thing you can pull out in a lot of different scenarios that can solve problems, at least in the short term.
I mean, even from the metabolic side, there's
definitely.
some evidence to suggest that like even glucose levels like come down when you're, you for
Oh, I think you say a
translocation.
lot of evidence
Yeah.
to suggest that. I think that there's no question that you would see that.
Sitting at Thanksgiving, just like doing this.
Yeah,
The stuffing's going in.
totally.
So when you look at, and I want to kind of pivot a little bit, but still within the same vein, when we're talking about clay mass that someone's already built and sort of maintaining that mass, do you happen to know just off cuff, like what the amount of volume is typically people need as a percentage, like compared to what it took them to build that to maintain it? Because I'm talking for myself here. I've noticed that I can get by with a pretty minimal amount of resistance training and still maintain my size if I'm in like an endurance block. Are there some harder numbers with that, or does it really vary from person to person?
It's both.
Yeah.
It depends on how long you've had to sustain that baseline, if you will. I'll give you an example, and I'll flip it a little bit, but I'll come right back to your question. So Kevin Hall published a paper a couple of days ago, really, really interesting. And what he was trying to do is plot out for fat loss how long it takes to people to stabilize on average. And what he looked at is, caloric restriction stuff, semaglutide, and other things like that, bariatric surgeries, and you just kind of want to say, like, of these different weight loss methods, when do people start to plateau? And what he actually found was most people with basic caloric restriction are going to do that in the 3 to 6, maybe up to 12-month range. Now, what that is really meaning is in those first probably 6 months or so, you are going to see change. And I would assume if you flip this to muscle growth, which is what you asked, you'll see a similar thing. Your first 6 months of training, you're probably going to be accelerating, well, you're definitely going to have an accelerated rate of increase of muscle growth. Once you get past 12 months of consistent hard training, that's going to stabilize. All right. So to your question, if you have this amount of muscle mass for a continued 12 months, I'm pretty confident saying this is like kind of a new baseline, if you will. If it is less than that 12 months, I don't think we're totally stabilized, which means my answer to your question would be different depending on those two markers. So if you are 6 or 16 years and you've been about this size, you've been training kind of like this, it clearly does not take much volume at all. I would imagine you could probably get away with 10 working sets per week, per muscle group, and keep where you're at, as long as your nutrition and protein intake and your sleep and like all the other variables are set to standard. Someone though who is maybe 8 months, who's really been training hard, or even 12 months, they might need to be closer to 15 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week to hold on to that. So it is variable, but there are still some numbers we can give people to give a rough range. This is actually also another question that I've changed my mind on very recently. This volume idea of how much volume do we have to maintain or even grow muscle mass, what's optimal, what's minimal. I think the data were pretty clear a few years ago that 10 working sets per week per muscle group is sufficient for many people. Now the numbers might be higher. So more papers have come out recently that say maybe it is closer to that 15 or 20. And even, again, going back to a couple years ago, it was more like 25 sets per muscle group per week. It's kind of like that mass threshold. But that's also because no study had done more than that. And now that more and more of the stuff that's come out, it looks like maybe that's not as aggressive and extreme as we think. It might even be higher. So I would say we don't actually really know the full end of that question. But those would be the variable plus the hard numbers that I could give you for that.
And if someone has had a certain level of muscle mass before and then they lost it due to, let's just not even say from injury, let's just say they just shift gears altogether and then they come back to it. Is it legitimately easier for them to build back to that stage, or is it kind of count as, newbie growth again? So if you rebuild back to that state, do you have to hold that 12 months again? Or if you've been there previously, lost it, and get back there? I mean, it might not even have data for it. It's more.
Yeah. Well, you have a couple of things working there. Anytime, like physiology is paying attention. So anytime you change stress up or down, you're going to get some alteration, adaptation. It's going to happen. So if you got to a certain level of muscle mass and then that dropped off for even a few months, it will come back pretty quickly, just as a training response sort of issue. So you could actually sort of call that newbie gains again.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like it's new to you, if you will. That having said, we have a lot of information on the ability of muscle to regrow if it's been previously to a state many years in the past. What's most interesting about that field is learning how or why.
Yeah.
That's the part we are yet to understand. For a lot of years, in fact, we've done a lot of work in this lab on myonuclear domain. And that is to say, so each one of your muscles are made up of millions of individual muscle fibers. Each one of those muscle fibers has thousands of nuclei. Those nuclei are what hold your DNA. They control the cell, they tell it grow, shrink, die, repair, all those things. So there was a theory, or an idea, hypothesis rather, that perhaps the muscle cells themselves will only grow in size to the extent at which the nuclei can control that area. A super easy analogy is if you opened up a business and you had a shop and you're selling ice cream or something, and you were the only owner or only person that worked there, you probably wouldn't want to triple the size of your shop without hiring somebody else, right? Too much area to manage and too many customers, and then you wouldn't open up another shop in another city, in another state until you had too much domain to cover. So that's called the myonuclear domain, right? Idea says like the domain is capped. But then more recent research has suggested like maybe that's not actually happening. In fact, a cool paper really just came out suggesting that myonuclei are actually not post-mitotic, which is what we thought, and they have in vivo changing. You're like, holy crap, okay. And that's because of data actually looking at satellite cells coming in and said satellite cells are not actually a requirement to bring in to actually see this process happen. So there's a lot to learn on that one, but it seems to be somewhat clear. There's an interesting paper that you may want to check out that looked at the physiological ramifications of plateauing for muscle growth. Okay, and so you can go read this. I think it's at an open access, so anyone can go look at it. Jeremy Lonicki out of Ole Miss, his team put this out there. It's very interesting. But in that, what they looked at is a handful of things. So some of the stuff that can happen that cause plateaus of muscle growth are things like potentially the myonuclear domain. Now, clearly we have some details to learn about what's happening there. But in your original question is, if that muscle is grown and lost, here's what's happening, theoretically. And again, I'll tell you the data are conflicting.
Yeah.
We don't know. But according to this idea, if this worked, if you grew muscle mass past the extent at which your myonuclei can control that, the only way you can continue to expand your muscle size is to either add more nuclei.
Okay.
We traditionally thought that means satellite cells had to come in, turn into nuclei, and now we can expand. Now it suggests that the nuclei themselves can potentially replicate or some other mechanism. Okay, great. So we have more managers in our store can expand. However, if you expand like that, and then you no longer train or stop training, and the cell now shrinks, the myonuclei stay around.
Okay, so you don't lay off the managers.
So you don't lay off the managers, and now you have 20 managers, working one booth. And now when you go to expand again, it's really fast and easy because you don't have to go through that process of hiring managers again.
Got it.
That's going to explain why people can have the muscle, lose it, and then come back faster than it took them to build the muscle in the first place.
Interesting.
Looks like that may or may not be happening though.
Yeah.
The mechanism, the process rather, is unknown, but the actual outcome is true. It is easier to grow that muscle back the second time. That part we know. It's just trying to figure out like why that's happening. So that's one part of it. The second part of the equation really of that question is, okay, if that's the case, what's actually stopping the muscle from continuing to grow? In other words, a lot of people will think, I'm at my genetic potential, things like that. That's probably pretty uncommon unless your fat-free mass index is really 26, 27, like getting up there. You're probably not at your genetic peak. Yeah. What's most likely happening is you're not plateauing at all, but the rate of increase has slowed down to where you just can't visualize it, right? Yeah. And so when you first started training, you could look at your muscles and you could see them getting larger, and you could take pre and post pictures, and 6 weeks later there's a visual change. Well, you may or may not be stalled anymore, but now the visual change takes 6 months, and it takes maybe a year. It's just going at such a slower rate. One of the things that's possibly happening is there's an idea that there are what are called molecular breaks. And so at the molecular level, it is breaking or slowing down that muscle growth through things like anabolic resistance, desensitization of signaling pathways, myonuclear domain potentially contributing. Most likely there's a lot of things that are going on in this. Resistance to things like IGF-1 receptors and testosterone, though that plays like a very minimal role in young people, particularly for things like muscle growth. But you get the idea. And so in general, the system is saying, hold on, we're slowing down. The same protein bolus that you had before is no longer going to stimulate the same growth. The same amount of training is not going to get there. So you either have to get more specific with your training. Maybe you need more volume. You need more total protein. Maybe now you need to go after protein timing, protein quality. So some of these things that don't matter globally may start to matter if you are getting close to that plateauing. So my tips on, if you think you're actually, not that you asked this, but I'll ask a question for you. If you think you're at plateauing with muscle mass, it's probably not likely, especially if you're in, less than 5 or 8 years of training, which is most people. Most likely you need to either assess you're just not driving enough stimuli because you become desensitized a little bit. So that might mean you need more volume per muscle group. You might have to go to the protein stuff that I talked about, or even just calories in general. And if it's not that, most likely you've got some big hole in your physiology. Sleep is insufficient, micronutrient deficiency, some or other thing that's suboptimal going on that's really causing the problems.
And I think in most people, most regular people that are watching this video, it's probably one of the lifestyle factors, right? Probably
oftentimes.
Not getting the sleep, not getting the diet, not getting the stimulus. They're not even covering the basics first. All right, what's another thing you've changed your mind on?
Another thing I've changed my mind on, actually based on data we've collected in our lab, and plenty of others, is I think the question about protein timing for most people for muscle growth is basically settled at this point, such as to say, we have known actually for a decent amount of time that making sure you get protein in immediately post-exercise is not super important. The total amount of protein you eat throughout the day is more relevant to muscle growth than the timing of those meals. And where I've changed my mind on that is I think there's enough data that suggests even if you're doing things like intermittent fasting, it still's probably not going to compromise muscle growth for most people, unless we get to practical problems, which I will say in a second. But physiologically, if you like to skip breakfast, or I shouldn't even say it that way, but if you like to wait and eat until it's in the afternoon or something like that, or if you eat in the morning and stop in the afternoon, if you've got a condensed eating window, for most people, I just don't think it's really going to matter in terms of protein intake for muscle growth. For other things, it absolutely does matter. The athletes we work with, it almost always matters. We very, very rarely, if ever, have an athlete eat like that for many other reasons. But if the only question we're asking is about protein intake for muscle growth, in most people, I just don't think the timing matters like really at all. And you can even sort of extend that to like look at the stuff that's coming out more recently on different types of protein. It's just super clear. Okay, your body's not that precious about it, unless you get into some exceptional scenarios, like you really are getting close to maximizing your muscle growth. You're many years in, you're probably competing in fitness or figure or bodybuilding, like you really are very, very high in your muscle mass. Then it starts to matter, but probably because of practical issues like, and we've seen this in our studies, it becomes hard to get 300 grams of protein in 2 hours. Just really pragmatically difficult. This is one of the other reasons like for our athletes, it's tough. It's tough to get in, right? It's just like you're eating a couple of meals and you're trying to do 100 plus grams of protein, and then you got to do that again in a couple more hours. When we have people that are, 170 pounds like me, it's not super hard to get your 200 grams of protein in a few hours. But when you start getting people that are 200, 220, 230, many of our athletes are over 300 pounds in the NFL. Some of our athletes in the NFL are over 370 pounds. So like you're really looking at 400 to 600 grams of protein in a couple of hours. Like that just becomes really, really challenging. So it's not necessarily a physiological thing per se, as it is there. So that is another thing I'd say, like I've really toned down my rhetoric on like making sure your protein is, in frequently. I do think it's a lot easier. I think it makes your life better, but I don't think it's required.
I've pivoted a bit on that too, almost from the other side of that. Not so much the protein discussion, but as someone that did a lot of compressed eating periods, it wasn't hard for me to get, 200 and something grams of protein in a compressed eating window.
Yeah.
But what would happen would flat out my caloric intake would be so low. And I used to say so much into camp of just the low carb world that I kind of put calories out of my mind entirely, which ended up becoming deleterious to my performance in a lot of ways because I was, as long as I make my protein, it's good, right? My protein needs are met. So I would fast, I would get in, 250 grams of protein in a compressed period, but my caloric intake would be so low.
Yeah.
And I think we saw, you probably know exactly what journal was published, but it just came out in February, is, the massive review, the carbohydrate review, the non-narrative review. It was like, and it illuminated it in a different way for me, talking about the carbohydrate piece, where it was like kind of universal, where it's like it didn't really matter, as long as glycogen stores were somewhat full. But what did matter was the calories that came in along with or without those carbs. It was like, okay, it didn't seem to matter if you had X amount of carbs 24 hours before your workout or not, but if your calories were lower the day before, it did matter. And that's what I noticed. I used to feel like, okay, if I reduce my caloric intake, body composition, the next day I'm gonna be fine. In fact, I'll probably feel fresher because I'm gonna have less inflammation, all this crap, right? And then it got to a point where I'm realizing, like, actually what seemed to matter the most for me, whether my protein needs were met or not, was my previous day's fuel intake. So my point in all of this is in line with what you're saying. It's like, okay, I paid attention to the protein, but I was neglecting the calorie piece. And that's what's hard for me. For me to get enough calories in a 4-hour eating block, if I'm not just chugging olive oil and getting it in a clean way, that's actually tougher than the protein. I could get 200 grams of protein in, but it's gonna be 1,200 calories or something.
Yeah, the other issue you run into is that stuff will tend to work if you're keeping carbohydrates very low.
Yeah.
Why I'm saying that is if you're trying to ingest, say, 300 to 600 grams of carbohydrate, which is not incredibly high, certainly 300 is not super high for high performing. For the average person who's working out 3 days a week, okay, that's different, right? But getting in 500, 600, 700 grams of carbohydrate can give you a ton of GI distress if you're bringing those things in like 2 or 3 meals in a couple of hour window, right? And so that becomes really, really challenging. One of the things that we noticed a lot, we've seen this multiple times, is you may or may not notice physical performance changes quickly, deleterious ones, right? So you may not drop muscle mass, your workouts might not change, but your physiology will start screaming. And if you start looking at markers, a really common one we have seen is you start seeing sleep disturbances. And it's like, okay, you're not having like insomnia, but you're definitely going down on sleep quality. And then we start looking deeper into physiology. One of the most common ones we've seen are things like this connection between sex hormone binding globulin, testosterone, and insulin. And so people don't realize that there's a very strong connection there. If your insulin gets too low because you're restricting calories too much, or carbohydrates as well, because you're in one of these compressed eating windows, if that's the case, doesn't mean it's going to happen, but you sort of brought this up. You said it happened to you, right? So just using your example, I would imagine your insulin started getting pretty low.
Very low.
If that thing gets low, you'll see an inverse association between that and sex hormone binding globulin. So that will go up. That will then mean it will bind and hold on to many of your anabolic protein, or hormones rather, testosterone. So in that case, you'll see SHBG go up and testosterone go down. And now people are freaking out about their testosterone and they're doing all these things. If you start seeing subjective symptoms, poor sleep, poor recovery, and the other things associated with lower testosterone, and then we start looking at your stuff and we're like, well, like this is all caused. Like all we have to do is give your carbohydrate intake a little bit higher. Everything then gets auto-corrected, and we've seen people's testosterone just take off from that. And you will see that with global caloric restriction as well. So it's really, really, really common. In fact, there's data on people, on actually females. In this one study in particular, I'm thinking, where they looked at, these were competitive, like fitness figure bodybuilders. I don't exactly remember which one, but something like that. Pretty lean girls, pretty well done. Put them at 50% caloric restriction for 24 weeks, I think something like that. In response to that, you see a 40% drop in resting energy expenditure. You're just tanking. Adaptive thermogenesis is ending your day, right? So it's fine, you will lose a bunch of weight really fast, but all those people, all those girls rather, I think they had something like a 30% testosterone drop.
Yeah.
They followed them for 4 more months after that. Testosterone still had not returned, even though they took their calories back up to maintenance. So you're potentially running into issues that are going to last a long time. It's not to say fasting's dangerous or like any of those things. my only point is to say, like, make sure you're looking under the hood as well, because just because you haven't seen performance drop, or your physique hasn't, or maybe it's going in the right direction, make sure you're also looking at other things, because these folks were in trouble for a long time. It took them well past the 3 to 4 month range to get testosterone back, and they still weren't at that level.
No, I mean, for me, it was a matter of taking fasting down to 2 days a week, and on the days that I do fast, as much as it goes against the grain of what my audience probably wants to hear, like, those are my higher carbohydrate days. I counteract the fact that I'm really squelching everything. I'm like, okay, these are the days when I'm going to have my carbohydrate intake higher, whereas it used to be the opposite. It used to be, okay, let's stay in a ketogenic state throughout this fast was putting me in a ketogenic state. Let's maintain that and kind of continue this fat adaptation stuff for the rest of the day. When I was overweight, that was okay. But especially now, being leaner and doing a lot more activity, it's very counterproductive for me to do that. So in the days when my calories are lower, I make a concerted effort to make sure that my carbohydrates are at least somewhat compensating for that.
Yeah. Nutritional ketosis in general is something I've absolutely changed my opinion on that. When that stuff first started coming on board, I was similar rhetoric as everybody else, like garbage, nothing, like all the negative things. That was certainly wrong. I think once I took more time to appropriately pay attention to there, I think I actually probably landed in a spot that hasn't really changed in many years. I think I actually remember sending a tweet out probably like 6 or 7 years ago that was like, hey, just be ready, because we're about to see a landslide of pro and beneficial ketosis research. Yeah. People are like, what do you mean? I'm like, no, not that people are going to fake it, but just like, I think this is better than a lot of us gave it credit for. And it clearly is. We actually had one of our clients in our coaching program, we just put on it for one of the few times ever. He actually is going through brain surgery for brain cancer. There is a lot of research on a lot of good applications for nutritional ketosis, a lot of them. More than I would have recommended. I actually am totally fine with people doing it for general population, especially people who don't exercise. If that works for you, great. Doesn't work for everyone. A lot of people gain weight on it, but a lot of people have great success with it. I would have really been negative about that 10 years ago. Now I'm like, hey, if that's great. Like, I got no issue. I'm not going to talk you out of that, ever. I can't say a single time we've ever taken any of our high performers.
That's what I was my next question, yeah.
No, none of our athletes and none of our high-performing executives, never had them go on a ketogenic diet ever. Yeah. I don't see, there's clearly no special benefit for performance. And by performance, I don't mean sports. I'm now saying like brain function, clarity. Yeah. I know people say this. I don't believe it to be the case at all.
I believe it's a lot of the, especially 10, 15 years ago when I was first starting to do it, I think I saw a huge lift in brain fog and whatever you want to call it, simply because by the nature of especially what was available in terms of ketogenic foods then, by default, I was going to wholesome food. I was just, eliminated the crap. I think now we're at a state now where people can do keto and still eat crap though. So I don't know if they're going to get the same benefits that I did maybe 12 years ago, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a difference of just approach. That's why I say, like, if people are not super into nutrition or don't have a lot of time, and kind of like the best thing they can do is minimize a whole bunch of processed carbohydrates, that's a net win. Yeah. Like, that's a very big win. And if they feel good on it, they feel great, their energy's stable, and their body composition is in the right spot, and like, why would I want them to do something different? It's clearly not dangerous for your long-term health. Clearly, some people can adhere to it for a long time, others can't, but that's the same of every diet, so that's not a real fair knock, right? That's fair. Where my position would differ on that a little bit is saying, okay, do we need to transition people to this? And the reason I'm saying we really don't ever do that is because if they are having a hard time with energy, if they're having a hard time with focus, or any of the other body composition things that people say like ketosis will fix, we've never run into a situation where we can't solve that problem without ketosis. Yeah. Something is going on. Something is happening in your physiology, the way your metabolic processes are running, your lifestyle, your sleep. Something's going on internal in your biochemistry. Something is happening there. To me, all you're doing is covering up signs. Yeah. And your body is screaming dysfunction, right? If you have a bagel and fall asleep, that's not a healthy physiology.
Yeah, that's not normal, yeah.
No, like that is me going, oh, interesting. Yeah. Like, not that you have to eat bagels to be healthy, of course, but my point is saying, like, to me, that as a coach and as a scientist, I'm looking at that going, oh, we've got work to do. Something is dysfunctional here. Yeah. Whether it is Again, any part of your physiology, your biochemistry, or your sleep, or like some part of you is dysfunctional. That's not a normal thing to have happen, right? If you have a bite of an apple and you tank afterwards, like, okay, your blood glucose shoots to 200, we've got problems, right? And to me, just from my perspective, because of what we do and the budgets we work on and the problems that we solve, avoiding the food is not the answer. Mm-hmm. I'm much more interested in going in like, well, no, let's fix that. That's a fixable thing. Yeah. And we do that continuously. If that's not your jam or you don't want to spend that time, I actually totally get it, because there's many aspects of my life that I don't. It's like my finances and my health, like, just fix it. I don't care. Like, avoid it. Don't do it. So that's cool. Like, I'm not.
Like, Galpin hasn't paid his taxes in 9 years.
No, that's the opposite. It's just more like, pay them all. I don't care. Like, just do whatever, right? Like, finance guy, I don't break down why we did. Like, just do it. I don't care, right? So I get it if people's jams are not like.
For sure.
I just want to feel better right now. Yeah. Absolutely get it.
But it's sort of like, hey, my marriage is in shambles, so just going to pull the plug and get a divorce, because the marriage makes me feel crappy, right? That's an extreme example, but
maybe we can use a better example. It's just more of like, my energy is low, I'll have more caffeine.
Yeah.
Okay, I do that. Okay. I will do that many more times the rest of my life, probably. But are you really, I'm more interested in scientifically going, all right, well, why? Yeah. Like, there's actually, that's telling us something. That's a fixable problem. You want to fix that? No, I want to cover the symptom. Cool. Oh, I want to fix that so I don't have to do this anymore. Okay, now I get really excited. Like, that's what we do. Yeah. But that's not for everybody.
No, it makes perfect sense. That's where I was 13, 14 years ago, realistically. I was type 2 diabetic, and it was just like, okay, carbs are bad because they're...
Oh, really?
Yeah, so when I was really overweight, that was the thing.
Geez, that's another good example. Like, if you're type 1 diabetic especially...
No, type 2 diabetic.
I know, but I'm saying if you are type 1 diabetic, the ketogenic diet makes pretty good sense.
Yeah.
Like, I would not have argued that, but now, I don't have to, but it makes pretty good sense. Type 2 diabetic, maybe not, but if that's the path that you got, which was clearly there, like, how could we argue that that's not awesome?
Yeah.
Clearly it was helpful for you.
And still to this day, I still have a little bit of glucose intolerance as a result of it, right? And in some ways, the ketogenic diet for people that are glucose intolerant can actually, I don't want to say make it worse, but there is evidence to suggest that you can make yourself more glucose intolerant.
Well, dude, this is physiology. I told you. It's paying attention, right? Yeah. So if you run away from problems, you're always playing a game of sensitive and resilient. Yep. The more you drive resilience, the less sensitivity you have, right? You're super dull. The more sensitivity you drive, you have no resilience. This is true of your physiology at all times. So everything you're doing in your physiology and lifestyle is pushing on one of these two levers. Really easy example, take alcohol consumption, okay? So if you want to become really resilient to alcohol, you would drink more often, right? What that means is people that drink consistently can have a drink and not wake up incredibly hungover the next day. Yeah. If you never drink, you're very, very sensitive to alcohol, then one drink you might feel terrible the next day. Okay, so that's an easy example of saying, if I had to choose, it's probably better to be pretty sensitive to alcohol. It's probably not going to be at a good spot where you can drink an entire bottle of wine and feel nothing the next day. Probably overly resilient on that one, right? So that one's a pretty easy choice. Other things are easier to say, okay, you actually want to drive resilience here, like insulin, right? Like blood glucose. You should be resilient, like calories in general. If you crash a couple of hours in your day because you haven't had a meal, you're overly sensitive, right? You're not resilient against not having food in your system. That's not a good spot to be in. Mm-hmm. You should be able to have a normal functioning day without any food. Every human being, that's an adult at least, should be able to go 24 hours without food, be fine cognitively, be fine emotionally, be fine physiologically. That's not a long period of time, okay? If you're like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I can't focus, and I'm such a jerk right now because I haven't had lunch, that's a sensitive physiology, and that's not a good spot to be in. So that's a case where we probably want to be more resilient. Other parts are now we're playing a game of choice, right? So maybe you want to be more resilient because of your personal preferences or what you're going after, what you like more, and maybe someone else wants to be more sensitive to that thing. But everything that we're doing is you're playing a game of driving one side or the other. And so really thinking about, what do I want to be resilient against and what do I want to be sensitive to? And then which ones don't want to be? But you have the power to change much of your physiology if you think about it in that context.
Well, that's well said. I kind of learned that the hard way when I found that, okay, even when I would come off of a ketogenic diet, then it's okay, why am I getting this insane glucose response? Why do I have this? Peripheral insulin resistance was one thing, but it was almost to a point of where I would, it was almost to a point of where I would consume carbohydrates and I would feel like garbage, right? So then it would kind of revalidate. You're like, well, okay, I guess I need to be, and don't get me wrong, I'm very pro ketogenic diet. Obviously, I had a lot of success with it, but I've realized, especially as an athlete, like I've realized, like, wait a minute, there is a very fine line here, because now it gets to a point where the very thing that I might need to recover is actually feeling like an encumbrance to my day, which just sends me down this cycle.
Yeah, and one would say the same thing for the idea of elimination diets.
Yeah.
Okay, so I eliminated dairy or gluten or plant-based protein, or I eliminated animal protein. It doesn't matter, right? When you remove something from physiology, your body optimizes against it. That's basic physiology. So when you bring it back in, you better expect poor results, right? Like, take anything out of your diet for 2 months and put it back in. Your body is going to probably not digest it well, most of the time, right? So that you didn't learn anything about your physiology. What you learned is your body moved from resilient to sensitive now, right? And so when you don't have carbohydrates, and then if you are in nutritional ketosis for 6 months, and then you go have 200 grams of carbohydrates, you better expect to feel terrible. Why? Because you have physiologically down-regulated many enzymes from the stomach, to the intestines, to muscle, to tissue, to blood, that are there to process and manage carbohydrates. So they've been down-regulated. It's not that your body and your physiology can't do it. If you've just now optimized against that, and you've hit it with something it hasn't seen in a long time, and it's going to throw the system into whack, right? It's not for validation, like you said, that carbohydrates are bad for you. The same would be true for the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Dairy, proteins, all these things. You're like, oh, I took it out for 7 days and then I put it back in and I got huge GI distress. Like, well, what you learned is your body changes based on what you're doing. That's what you've learned. Just to round that out, like, if you have run that stuff and you still want to pay attention to your body, right? Because there certainly are people who don't do well on gluten. Yeah. That's a real thing, for sure. Same thing with dairy. That's a real thing. Anything else, when people say those things, I believe them. Yeah. Physiology is wonderful. It's really complex. I believe all that stuff happens, right? But maybe we don't want to think about it, or I guess maybe if we think about it from the perspective of resilience and sensitivity, we won't jump the gun quite as much on the thinking our physiology can't or can do something.
It's kind of the difference between optimizing and maximizing, right? It's like, I mean, if you're constantly chasing optimization by removing or by fine-tuning, there's a very small percentage of people, and I mean this with the utmost respect to a lot of people, but a very small amount of people that really need to be focusing on optimizing, right? A lot of people just need to be focusing on, like, okay, how do I just get the most out of my life rather than try to optimize just for this? And I think that's somehow where we've ended up a lot of times with the internet. It just kind of ends up that way, where it's, I mean, algorithmically you end up down a rabbit hole and you can say, like, okay, I need to optimize this, and this, and then you're now optimal here, but you're suboptimal everywhere else. I think, forget the nature of the word optimize, right?
It's optimized and it's adaptation.
Yeah.
That's the same as stress and resilience, right? It is short-term and long-term gratification. Think of these however you want. But if you're paying attention to optimization at all times, you are reducing adaptation. If you're only going after adaptation, you're cutting under optimization. Yeah. That's how it works. So if you and I right now chose to optimize our current day, we would do things that are going to shortcut our long-term adaptations. Yeah. That's how it works, right? In the inverse, if I try to maximize my long-term benefit, my adaptations right now, I wouldn't optimally be performing today. Let's just take fasting. Maybe you are someone who doesn't do well when you're hungry. Okay, great. So maybe you make the choice to go hungry for a while. Now, what's going to happen on that day? You're going to perform poorly. You've not optimized that day, but you've hedged towards adaptation. You're saying, I'm sacrificing now to get an adaptation later. But you know performance is going to go down today because you've just told me your performance goes down when you fast. Amazing. The inverse is you go, hey, look, I have to perform great every single day. I want every day to be optimized. Then you're going to do things that further then drive. You're going to eat every hour. You're going to make sure you have an IV in you that's constantly pumping glucose in you nonstop. What you're going to make is your body way worse about skipping a meal. Look at, we've done actually some stuff with people who sail around the world. So these are one-man boats that sail around the world, and they have to do polyphasic sleep. So they have to do 20-minute sleep sections for months at a time. So it's like every 4 hours, 20 minutes. If they miss one of those 20-minute windows, they are blown to pieces, like completely blown to pieces, because they've pushed themselves to be in a position where it's like, we have to sleep for 20 minutes to get here, and if we miss this window, like, we're absolutely toast because it's such a bad, like, sleeping thing for natural humans. But that's just one example of saying, hey, look, we have to get all the way over here, into this like optimization thing, because that's the only way we can be awake enough to sail this boat around the world by ourselves, or we're going to die. At the consequence, though, of adaptation. So they've chose adapting, but they're highly sensitive to any small change in their day. Day is wrecked, right? You go the opposite direction and you look at people who are constantly flipping back and work with like shift work or night nurses and then day shift, other things like that. They're super, super resilient, but they're also never feeling good.
Yeah.
Like they're never going to have a great day because they're always back and forth. At the same time, they can fall asleep instantly for 8 hours, anytime. They can also stay awake for 36 hours, like no time, but they're really not going to be performing that well, and they're certainly harming their long-term health, right?
Yeah.
Those data are clear. So you have those things that are always at your spectrum. Last example, and this may be a bit redundant, but to maybe sink this thing in, to anchor into people's brain one more time, it is, think about this from the perspective of short and long-term gratification, right? So your kids, we've got 4 and 6 year olds, respectively, right? They're almost always choosing short-term gratification, right? That's the decision they're going to make right now, right? We're in our 30s and 40s, we're almost always going to be choosing long-term stuff. So you're investing your money and you're making smart choices with your training, so you're not hurt now, but because you know you're going to pay for that 5 years, 10 years down the road, like all these things. We've flipped in that perspective. People that are always choosing short-term, or mostly or more often choosing short-term gratification, are going to be unhealthy for the most part. They're going to be physically unhealthy, they're going to be mentally unhealthy, right? Because what is the next thing that gives me the next enjoyment, right? This is more, you're more, not temperamental, but you're more like our kids. What's the phrase I'm looking for?
Impulsive.
You're more impulsive, right? Great. So your nutrition choices, but you skip your workout because you don't feel great today, because it's like all those things, right? But you know that causes long-term. The people on the other end of the spectrum, though, that only choose long-term gratification, also run into mental health problems because you're never present. You're never here. You're always worrying about there. Rumination, anxiety, like what's next, right? All those problems are there. They're never satisfied, never happy, never present, never enjoying the moment, like all those other issues that are there. And one would argue, like you're also maybe potentially compromising life experience. Yeah. You should be able to do some wild stuff every once in a while. Yeah. Spend some money, buy the thing, take the day off, eat the food, or whatever, right there. So they're always doing that because they want to make sure that they're as lean as possible 65 years from now, or whatever. It's like, okay, maybe just chill, like there. So where you want to land that spectrum is up to you. There's no perfect answer, but just, I guess, maybe recognize you are making a choice in both those scenarios, and that's what you're giving up.
I think there is wiggle room on both of those, right? Like there's
huge.
Like if I did everything health perspective, that was going to be, what every longevity expert says to do. I've thought about literally doing a video on how ridiculous that would be and how my performance would suffer if I did everything that every longevity expert says to do, right? Like, the big name ones. And it's just like, at the end of the day, like you do sacrifice your today. And is going in training at the intensity most of your athletes train at today really good for them from a long-term perspective? If they continue to do that for the rest of their life, probably not, but it also brings them emotional satisfaction. Totally. And so there's okay, I'm going to optimize for today because this makes me happy, but knowing full well I'm making deposits that are going to optimize me for the long haul as well.
Yeah, and there's no right answer here, right? No right answer for anybody per day, per week, per month, per year, per sector, nutrition, personal finance. It's always a mosaic, right? It's just the acknowledgement that those choices are being made.
Well, where can everyone find you, man?
Easiest place, Twitter and Instagram. And then I have a YouTube channel. It's not particularly active, but for direct science communication, that's the easiest place. And if you want to see all the stuff we have, our coaching programs and our blood work and our sleep programs and all that other stuff, you can find, I think, all that on just my website, andygalpin.com.
Perfect. Thanks, my man.
Yep. Thanks.